John had always considered himself an ordinary guy living an ordinary life. He was 32, single, and spent most of his days working at Benny's Diner, a small family-owned restaurant in the heart of town. The diner was a place where everyone knew your name, and the people were more like family than customers. John had been working there for 5 years, and he knew the regulars by heart. He took pride in his job, always making sure his customers felt seen and valued. It was a quiet, humble life, one that he had grown comfortable with. Every day was filled with the same routine. Wake up early, put on his apron, and head over to Benny's, where he'd work the morning shift, serving coffee and eggs to the same crowd that came in day after day. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady. The pay was enough for him to pay his bills and get by. He'd never really thought much about anything beyond his small world, but there was one regular customer that made his days just a little bit brighter: Mrs. Wren. Mrs. Wren was a tiny elderly woman who always came to Benny's alone, sitting at the same corner booth by the window, her cane resting beside her. She had a gentle face, with silver hair neatly pulled into a bun, and her eyes sparkled despite her years. She was one of those rare souls who carried an air of quiet wisdom about her, though she didn't often share much about herself. She always ordered the same thing: a cup of chamomile tea, no sugar, and a small bowl of oatmeal with just a dash of cinnamon. For the longest time, John had only exchanged pleasantries with her. "How's the weather today, Mrs. Wren?" he'd ask as he poured her tea. "Better than yesterday," she'd always reply with a soft chuckle. It was a simple exchange, but it felt comforting to John, a connection of sorts, a shared moment in a world that often felt disconnected. One particular Thursday morning, however, things felt different. The air was crisp as John entered the diner, wiping his feet on the mat and hanging his jacket by the door. The familiar smell of coffee and bacon filled the space, but his mind was elsewhere. He was tired, drained from a long week of work and sleepless nights. He had no particular plans for the weekend, just the usual: work, sleep, repeat. As John made his way to the back to grab his apron, he noticed Mrs. Wren sitting at her usual spot, but today something was off. Her back seemed a little more hunched than usual, and she was fidgeting with the napkin on the table, her hands trembling ever so slightly. John watched her for a moment before stepping forward. "Good morning, Mrs. Wren," he said with a warm smile, trying to hide the concern creeping into his voice. She looked up at him, her blue eyes flickering with something he hadn't seen before: vulnerability. "Good morning, John," she replied softly. "It's a bit cold today, don't you think?" She smiled faintly, but it didn't reach her eyes. John took her order and went about his usual routine, serving the other customers and attending to the needs of the rest of the diner. But throughout the morning, he couldn't shake the image of Mrs. Wren sitting there alone, her once steady hands now trembling with age and fragility. As the day went on, he found himself stealing glances at her from behind the counter. Something inside him told him that she wasn't feeling quite herself today. Around lunchtime, John noticed she hadn't touched her oatmeal. Her tea sat untouched, cooling beside her. This was unusual. Mrs. Wren was always a creature of habit. She would eat her oatmeal slowly, savoring every bite. But today, the spoon rested in her lap, her hands shaking slightly as she stared out the window. John felt a pang of worry and made his way over to her booth. "Everything okay, Mrs. Wren?" he asked gently, leaning in slightly. She looked up at him, her eyes glistening. "Oh, John, I'm just a little tired today, that's all." Her voice quivered, and John could tell that something more was going on. It wasn't just fatigue. There was a sadness there, a weariness that went beyond what could be fixed with a nap. He hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to help, but then the words came to him. "Would you like some help with your oatmeal, Mrs. Wren?" he asked, his voice low. "I can cut it up for you, if you'd like. It might be easier." She looked at him, a moment of surprise flickering across her face. "You'd do that for me?" she asked, her voice soft, and filled with a kind of gratitude that made John's heart ache. Without waiting for her response, he gently took the spoon from her hand and began to cut the oatmeal into smaller pieces, making sure it was just the right consistency for her to eat comfortably. As he did, he noticed how frail her hands were, how slow and deliberate her movements had become. She had lived a full life, no doubt, but John couldn't help but wonder if her time was coming to an end soon. "Thank you, John," Mrs. Wren whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "You're a good soul." John smiled at her, though his heart felt heavy. "It's no trouble at all," he said, brushing off the feeling. "You've always been kind to me, Mrs. Wren. It's the least I can do." As he continued to help her, he realized just how much he valued the quiet moments he spent with her. There was something special about her, something that made him want to do more, to give more, to help her in ways that went beyond the job. For a moment, he even considered sitting down with her, talking about her life, hearing her stories. But before he could offer, the manager, Mr. Thompson, came bustling by. "John, get back to work, would you?" he snapped. "Don't spend all day with the customers. We got a full house, and I don't pay you to be a charity case." John's heart sank at the reprimand, but he nodded obediently, excusing himself from the booth. Mrs. Wren gave him a sad smile as he walked away, and for the first time, he wondered just how much of her loneliness went unnoticed by the rest of the world. That afternoon, as John continued to serve customers and maintain the flow of the restaurant, he couldn't shake the image of Mrs. Wren's trembling hands and fragile frame. He kept thinking about how, for all the people who walked through the diner's doors each day, none of them seemed to notice her, really. They didn't see her struggle or her quiet need for companionship. But John did, and something inside him began to change. The next morning, John arrived at Benny's diner earlier than usual. The streets were still quiet, with only a few cars passing by, their headlights cutting through the fog that lingered over the town. The air was thick with the promise of a chilly autumn day. John could feel the weight of the previous day on his shoulders. The image of Mrs. Wren's trembling hands haunted him. He wondered how often she had to struggle with even the simplest tasks, how many mornings she woke up and felt the sting of loneliness in her bones. The thought gnawed at him as he walked through the diner's front door, the familiar bell above the door jingling as it closed behind him. The smell of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon greeted him, the usual rhythm of the diner humming in the background as the staff got ready for the rush. John tied on his apron with a sigh, his thoughts still with Mrs. Wren. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her quiet demeanor than met the eye. He wondered how much she had lost in her life. How many friends had faded away? How many family members had passed? John had been raised to value the elderly, taught by his grandmother that each wrinkle and gray hair was a testament to a life lived fully. But today the thought of Mrs. Wren's silence felt heavier than it had the day before. By the time the diner began to fill up, Mrs. Wren had already arrived. She was sitting at her usual corner booth, the same spot by the window, staring out at the world beyond with that distant look in her eyes. John's heart tugged as he saw her there, so small and delicate against the backdrop of the bustling restaurant. He approached her table, offering his usual greeting. But today, he couldn't hide the concern in his voice. "Good morning, Mrs. Wren," he said, a little softer than usual. She looked up at him, her face creasing into a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Good morning, John. It's a little warmer today, don't you think?" She replied, her voice steady, but with a faint quiver that only someone paying attention would notice. John nodded, trying to mask the worry he felt. "Yeah, it's nice. How are you today?" he asked gently. "I'm fine," she answered quickly, but there was something in the way she said it that told him she wasn't. He could feel the weight of her words, the hesitation hanging in the air. He didn't want to pry, but his concern was growing. He had never seen her quite like this before. "Would you like your usual?" he asked, trying to keep the conversation light, though his heart was heavy. She nodded, and he quickly took her order, making his way to the kitchen to prepare her meal. But as he worked, his mind kept drifting back to Mrs. Wren. Something inside him felt an overwhelming urge to do more for her, to show her that she wasn't invisible. When he returned with her tea and oatmeal, he noticed that she hadn't touched her tea yet. Instead, she was staring at the steaming cup, her hands resting in her lap. John placed the cup in front of her gently, and then sat across from her, something he rarely did. "Mrs. Wren, if you don't mind me asking," he began, his voice softer than usual, "is there anything you'd like to talk about? You don't seem like yourself today." Her eyes flickered up to meet his, a faint sadness lingering there, before she quickly looked away. She sighed deeply, the kind of sigh that came from a lifetime of quiet sorrow. "Oh, John," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I've been alone for so long. I don't think anyone even notices anymore. But you've always been kind to me." Her voice trailed off, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. John could feel the weight of her loneliness in those words, the pain that came with years of solitude. He didn't know what to say. He had never been particularly good at dealing with people's emotions, but looking at Mrs. Wren, he couldn't help but feel a surge of empathy. He had to do something. He had to let her know she wasn't invisible. "Mrs. Wren," he said, his voice steady, "you're not alone. You're never alone here. I see you, and I'm grateful for every conversation we've shared. You've got a place here, with me, with everyone. You don't have to carry this burden by yourself." She smiled, a small, grateful smile, but the sadness remained in her eyes. "Thank you, John. You've always been so kind. You remind me of my late husband, the way he would always look out for me, even when he was tired." Her voice cracked at the mention of her husband, and John's heart tightened. It was a reminder of how much she had lost, how much she was still carrying. The conversation shifted to lighter topics after that. She shared stories of her younger days, of the time when she and her husband would take walks in the park, hand in hand. John listened intently, hanging on to every word she said. It was clear that she cherished these memories, and he made a promise to himself that he would never take her presence for granted. As the morning wore on, the diner became busier, and John had to return to his duties. But every so often, he would glance over at Mrs. Wren's booth, watching her take slow, deliberate sips of her tea, her hands now steady as she picked at her oatmeal. For a brief moment, he wondered what more he could do for her, how he could make her feel seen in a world that often overlooked the elderly. The rest of the morning passed in a blur, but John couldn't stop thinking about Mrs. Wren. Her sadness had touched something deep inside him, and he knew that he wanted to do more than just serve her food. He wanted to make her feel valued, to remind her that she was important, not just to him, but to everyone who passed through those diner doors. That afternoon, as John wiped down the counter and prepared to close up for the day, he felt a strange sense of purpose. It wasn't just about the job anymore. It was about something deeper, something that had been awakened within him. It was the desire to make a difference, no matter how small, in someone else's life. As he stepped outside into the cool evening air, John looked up at the sky, the first stars beginning to appear. He took a deep breath, knowing that from this day forward, things were going to be different. He wasn't just a waiter anymore. He was someone who could make a difference, someone who could see people for who they truly were, someone who could be a light in someone else's darkness. And for the first time in a long while, John felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. The next few days at Benny's Diner seemed to carry on with an almost painful regularity. John felt a deep sense of unease lingering in the air as the story of his interaction with Mrs. Wren spread through the small town. It was a quiet town, where everyone knew everyone else's business, and as word got out, it didn't take long for the whispers to start. It wasn't the kindness that people were talking about. No, it was the manager's response. John hadn't given it much thought at first. He'd simply been doing what felt right, what he believed was part of his job as a decent human being. Helping Mrs. Wren had been a small gesture, one that seemed inconsequential in the grand scheme of things. But in the eyes of Mr. Thompson, the diner's manager, It had been a glaring problem. The day after John had helped Mrs. Wren, he'd received an email from Mr. Thompson calling him into the office for a discussion. It wasn't unusual for the manager to give him feedback, though it was rare for the conversations to go beyond the usual "keep your pace up" or "make sure you're cleaning thoroughly." But this time, John could sense something was different, something ominous hanging over the email's simple words. He tried to brush it off, but as he walked through the back door of the diner that morning, he felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The kitchen was unusually quiet as he tied on his apron, the clatter of dishes and the hum of conversation filling the space. His coworkers, mostly young and eager, seemed too busy to notice his mood. They went about their work with the enthusiasm that comes from youth and energy, but John's mind was far from the fryers and grills. He couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled deep inside him. The brief glance he had caught from Mr. Thompson in the morning, sharp and judgmental, had made him uneasy, as though he were being judged for something he hadn't even realized was wrong. An hour passed before the manager appeared in the kitchen, looking as stern as ever. Mr. Thompson was a man who had made it clear from the very first day John started at Benny's that he wasn't much for small talk or pleasantries. He ran a tight ship, and everything had to be done according to the rules, his rules. But John had always managed to get along with him, even if they didn't share much beyond the usual work-related exchanges. This time, however, things felt different. "John, I need to speak with you," Mr. Thompson said, his tone businesslike, with an edge of something more. He led John to the office in the back corner of the diner, a small, cluttered space that smelled faintly of stale coffee. As John sat down across from him, he couldn't help but feel a lump form in his throat. He had no idea what was coming. "I've been hearing things, John," Mr. Thompson began, his voice clipped, "about your behavior with the customers." John's heart skipped a beat, his stomach twisting. "What do you mean?" he asked, trying to sound casual, though he could feel the tension building in his chest. "I'm talking about the elderly lady, Mrs. Wren. I've heard you spent a considerable amount of time with her the other day, helping her with her meal, cutting her food, chatting with her like she's your family. That's not what we're here to do, John. We serve food. We don't babysit." John's eyes widened in disbelief. He had expected some kind of reprimand. But this felt like something else entirely. "I was just helping her. She's an elderly woman. She was struggling," John said, his voice trembling with the shock of the accusation. "I don't care," Mr. Thompson snapped, his eyes narrowing. "You're paid to serve meals, not to coddle customers. This is a business, not a charity, and I won't have you undermining the professionalism of this place." John sat there, stunned. He could hardly believe what he was hearing. He had always thought of the diner as a place where the customers came first, where you treated people with respect, kindness, and care. Wasn't that part of the job? "I'm sorry, but I don't see what the problem is," John replied quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. The manager leaned forward, his eyes hard. "I'm giving you a warning, John. One more incident like that, and you'll be out of here. Do you understand?" John opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. His head was spinning. He had been helping Mrs. Wren, treating her with the dignity and respect she deserved, and this was how he was being repaid. He had always been taught that kindness and empathy were virtues, things to be proud of. But here, in this place, it seemed they were liabilities. He felt a deep sense of betrayal, as if the very values he held dear were being trampled by the cold, calculated nature of the diner's management. The rest of the day passed in a blur for John. He moved through his shifts mechanically, trying to push the conversation with Mr. Thompson out of his mind, but it kept creeping back in, gnawing at him. How could he have done something so wrong by simply being kind? Was it wrong to show empathy, to help someone in need? The weight of the decision he had made earlier, the decision to help Mrs. Wren, to put her needs before the demands of the job, seemed heavier now. Was it worth it? By the time the dinner rush came, John had resigned himself to the fact that he was probably going to lose his job, but he still couldn't shake the feeling of injustice that clung to him. As the evening wore on, more and more people filtered through the diner, each with their own stories, their own lives. Some smiled and laughed, others simply sat in silence, eating their food, lost in their own worlds. But John couldn't stop thinking about Mrs. Wren, about how, in her own quiet way, she had trusted him to help her. He had always believed in treating people with kindness, and now, for the first time in his life, he felt like that belief had been betrayed. It wasn't long before the inevitable happened. The next afternoon, just as John had expected, Mr. Thompson called him into the office once again. This time, the conversation was short and brutal. "I'm sorry, John, but I'm going to have to let you go," Mr. Thompson said, his voice devoid of any empathy. "Your behavior has been unprofessional, and it's not something we can tolerate here." John sat there for a moment, the words sinking in. He had known this was coming, but it didn't make it any easier. "I understand," he said, his voice barely audible. He stood up, gathering his things, the weight of the decision feeling heavier than ever. As he walked out of the diner for the last time, his heart felt heavy with a mixture of anger, disbelief, and sadness. He had done the right thing, hadn't he? He had helped someone in need, shown kindness to someone who had no one else. And yet, here he was, out of a job, with nothing to show for it but the empty feeling of betrayal. But as he walked down the street, something began to stir inside him. A quiet voice telling him that this wasn't the end, that something bigger was coming. Little did he know, the shock of his firing would soon set off a chain of events that would change his life forever. The days following John's abrupt dismissal from Benny's diner felt like a blur. He wandered through the motions of life, not entirely sure what to do next. His routine had been shattered. The diner, once a place where he felt like he belonged, now felt like a distant memory, a chapter in his life that had closed far too soon. He spent the next few days wallowing in a mix of anger and confusion. How had it come to this? He had only tried to do what was right. He had helped someone who needed it, someone who was often overlooked. And yet, here he was, out of a job, facing the consequences of his simple act of kindness. John found himself sitting at the kitchen table, staring at his phone. He had a few leads on other jobs, but none of them felt right. He wasn't sure he wanted to get back into another restaurant job, not after what had happened. His mind kept drifting back to the moment he had been called into Mr. Thompson's office, the way the manager had looked at him with such disdain, as if kindness was something to be punished. It didn't make sense to him. It wasn't fair. He had expected to be met with understanding, with appreciation for his willingness to go above and beyond for a customer. But instead, he had been met with rejection and, ultimately, a cold, heartless decision. A few days after his firing, John received an unexpected call from someone he hadn't heard from in years. Paul, an old friend from high school. Paul had always been the more ambitious one, always looking for the next big opportunity, while John had remained content in his steady, predictable life. Paul was now managing a restaurant across town, a trendy spot that had gained some local attention. "Hey, John, I heard what happened at Benny's. I'm sorry, man. That place was never the right fit for you. Listen, we got a spot open at my place. I could use someone like you. Why don't you come down? Check it out." John hesitated for a moment, the weight of his recent experience still hanging over him. The last thing he wanted to do was walk into another restaurant where he could face the same kind of judgment, the same kind of cold, corporate environment. But Paul was different. He had always been a believer in doing what was right, even when it wasn't popular. John agreed to meet him the next day, though he was still uncertain. The next morning, John put on his best clothes and made his way to the new restaurant. It was a sleek, modern space with clean lines and an open kitchen. The atmosphere was different from Benny's, more upscale, with a mix of young professionals and artists scattered throughout. Paul greeted him at the door with a wide grin, as if no time had passed since their high school days. "I'm glad you could make it," Paul said, clapping him on the back. "Let's take a look around, see what you think." As they walked through the restaurant, John couldn't help but notice the stark contrast between this place and Benny's. It was a polished environment, one that was clearly built for success. The staff seemed well trained, but there was a warmth to the place that Benny's had never had. Paul led him to a small office at the back of the restaurant, where they sat down to discuss the opportunity. "So, what do you think? It's not Benny's, but I think you'd fit in well here," Paul said, his eyes searching John's face for a reaction. John sat quietly for a moment, feeling a shift in his mind. He thought about the past few days, about the anger and frustration he had felt. He thought about the decision to help Mrs. Wren, how it had come from a place of genuine care, and how that had been twisted into something negative. But as he sat there in Paul's office, surrounded by a different kind of energy, he began to realize something. He had been stuck in the wrong place for too long. It wasn't just about the job. It was about the values that the job represented. Benny's had never been a place where kindness was celebrated, where doing the right thing was encouraged. This place, however, felt different. Paul's restaurant had a culture of respect and care for both customers and staff. After a moment of reflection, John looked up at Paul and nodded. "Yeah, I think I'd like to give it a shot," he said, a newfound determination in his voice. Paul smiled and extended his hand. "Welcome aboard." John's first week at the new restaurant was a whirlwind. Everything was fresh and exciting. New faces, new routines, and a different kind of energy. He quickly got to know the staff, who were friendly and welcoming. Unlike at Benny's, where he had always felt like just another cog in the machine, here he felt like he was part of a team, part of something that valued his input and his experience. He started off slowly, learning the ropes, observing how things were done, but it wasn't long before he found his rhythm. One evening, a week into his new job, a familiar face walked into the restaurant. It was Mrs. Wren. She had a small bag in her hands, her cane resting against the chair as she took a seat at the bar. John's heart skipped a beat when he saw her, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. He hadn't expected to see her here, not after everything that had happened. He walked over to her, his hands slightly trembling as he greeted her. "Mrs. Wren, I didn't expect to see you here," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. She looked up at him, her eyes bright with a quiet spark that hadn't been there the last time they had spoken. "I've heard good things about this place," she said with a smile. "I thought I'd give it a try." John took a deep breath, feeling a swell of emotion in his chest. He hadn't expected this moment, hadn't expected to see Mrs. Wren again, especially not so soon. But as he stood there, looking at her, he realized that the kindness he had shown her wasn't something that had gone unnoticed. It had made a difference in her life, just as it had made a difference in his. As he sat down beside her, taking a break from his duties for just a moment, they talked for a while. Mrs. Wren told him about her life, about her late husband, and the days when they would go out for walks together. She talked about how, in her quiet way, she had always tried to make the best of things, even when life hadn't been easy. And for the first time in a long while, John felt a sense of peace. He had made the right choice by helping her. He had made the right choice by choosing kindness, even when the world around him had told him it wasn't the way to succeed. As the night wore on, and the restaurant began to fill with the laughter and chatter of customers, John couldn't help but feel that everything had come full circle. In this new place, he had found something he hadn't realized he was missing. People who valued him for who he was, who appreciated the kindness he had to offer, and who saw the world the way he did. But more than that, he had found a place where he could be himself, where the decisions he made weren't dictated by corporate interests or cold rules. Here, he could make a difference. And in that moment, he knew that whatever came next, he was exactly where he needed to be. As the weeks passed, John's life began to settle into a rhythm that felt not only comfortable but fulfilling. He wasn't just going through the motions anymore. At Paul's restaurant, he had found a sense of purpose that had been missing from his days at Benny's. His role had evolved from just another waiter to someone who played an active part in the restaurant's success. He became more involved in the planning, helping the kitchen with special requests, and even managing the evening shifts when Paul wasn't around. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was honest, and it was deeply satisfying. The staff at the restaurant treated John with a level of respect he hadn't experienced before. His opinion mattered here, and his commitment to creating a welcoming atmosphere was valued. There was a culture in Paul's restaurant of looking out for one another, of treating each customer with respect and each staff member like family. It wasn't about who made the most money or who was the most talented. It was about creating an experience, about fostering genuine connections. John thrived in this environment, pouring his energy into making every night memorable, not just for the customers, but for the team. What surprised John most was the way the regular customers began to respond to him. They noticed the difference. They could feel the warmth in the air when they walked through the doors, the sincerity behind the service. The restaurant became a favorite spot for locals, not just because of the food, but because of the sense of community it exuded. John was a big part of that community, not just serving food but creating relationships. People came back because of the care he put into every interaction, because they knew he was truly listening when they spoke. He began to build a reputation for himself as someone who went above and beyond, not just to serve, but to connect. One evening, a few months into his new job, something unexpected happened that would change everything. The restaurant had a particularly busy night, and John had just finished a double shift, his feet sore and his body aching from the constant movement. As the last customers left, he began to clean up, his mind drifting to thoughts of a much-needed rest. But then he noticed an envelope left on one of the tables, addressed to him. It was a small, unassuming envelope, but there was something about it that made his heart race. Curiosity got the better of him, and he opened it slowly, pulling out a letter. The handwriting was familiar, but it took a moment for John to recognize it. It was Mrs. Wren. The letter was brief but powerful. She wrote about how grateful she was for the kindness he had shown her when she needed it most. She thanked him for treating her like a human being, for showing her the kind of compassion that had been lacking in her life for so long. The letter wasn't just a thank you, it was an acknowledgement. Mrs. Wren, the woman who had seemed so small and forgotten, had written about how his simple act of kindness had helped her rediscover her own sense of worth. She mentioned how she had been too ashamed to reach out for help for so long, too proud to admit she was struggling. But John had made her feel seen, valued, and for the first time in years, truly cared for. But there was more. The last paragraph of the letter was the one that left John speechless. Mrs. Wren had shared that she was selling her house, moving into a smaller place closer to her family, and that the sale had gone through. She had left a small sum of money to John as a gesture of thanks. It wasn't a fortune, but the gesture was enormous in its meaning. She had left him a gift, not because she felt obligated, but because she wanted him to know that he had made a lasting impact on her life. John sat down at the table where the letter had been left, staring at the words in disbelief. The kindness he had shown, something that had felt so small at the time, had changed the trajectory of someone's life. And now, it seemed, Mrs. Wren had repaid him in the only way she knew how, by recognizing his goodness, by giving back in a way that John never expected. But the letter also sparked something within him. It made him realize just how powerful acts of kindness could be, not just in the moment, but in the long term. He had spent so much of his life thinking that kindness was a simple thing, something that didn't always have lasting effects. But Mrs. Wren's letter proved him wrong. It was a reminder that the smallest acts of compassion could ripple out and touch lives in ways he couldn't have imagined. In the days that followed, John felt a shift within himself. He wasn't just a worker anymore, not just a waiter at a restaurant. He was a part of something bigger, a community of people who were all trying to make the world a little bit better, one small act of kindness at a time. It was clear to him now that his journey wasn't just about a job. It was about making a difference in the lives of those around him. He realized that even when things didn't go as planned, when he was fired, when he was lost, when he felt alone, everything had led him to this moment, to this place where he had found a sense of purpose and belonging. As for Mrs. Wren, her impact on John didn't stop with the letter. She continued to visit the restaurant, sometimes bringing along family or friends, sometimes sitting alone in her corner booth, enjoying a cup of tea. She was a symbol of everything John had learned during his time at the restaurant. That kindness, that simple gesture of looking out for others, could change the world. He would always be grateful for the day he had helped her, and for the way her generosity had touched his heart. And then, one evening, the inevitable happened. Mr. Thompson, the former manager of Benny's Diner, walked into the restaurant. He was unrecognizable from the man John had known. His clothes were disheveled, and his eyes were weary, like a man who had been worn down by his own choices. Word had gotten around about the investigation into Benny's Diner and the financial troubles that had come to light. It was clear to John that the once thriving restaurant was on its last legs. As Mr. Thompson approached the bar where John was standing, he seemed almost nervous. "John," he said, his voice quieter than it used to be. I heard about the success you've had here. The restaurant's doing well, isn't it?" John looked at him for a long moment, the years of resentment and hurt still fresh in his mind. But then he saw something in Mr. Thompson's eyes, a flicker of humility, of recognition. "Yeah, it's doing great," John replied, his voice steady but not unkind. "Sometimes doing the right thing works out, even when the world doesn't seem to notice." Mr. Thompson nodded, his shoulders sagging. "I didn't understand what you were trying to do back then, John. I see it now. I was wrong. About you, about everything. I've lost everything. I'm sorry." John didn't say anything for a moment, just stood there, letting the words hang in the air. He had every right to be angry, to resent the man who had wronged him. But in that moment, he realized that holding on to the past wasn't going to change anything. The only thing he could control was how he chose to move forward. And so, with a quiet nod, he simply said, "It's never too late to do better." As Mr. Thompson walked out of the restaurant, John felt a quiet sense of closure wash over him. His journey had come full circle, and though it had been difficult, it had led him to a place where he knew he was exactly where he needed to be. The road hadn't been easy, but the lessons he had learned about kindness, humility, and the power of making a difference were ones he would carry with him forever. And in the end, that was the greatest reward he could have asked for. Months passed, and John's life continued to flourish in ways he hadn't anticipated. He had long since adjusted to his new role at Paul's restaurant, and each day brought new challenges and opportunities for growth. The space that had once seemed unfamiliar had become a second home, and the team he worked with had become more like family than coworkers. Every day was filled with purpose. He was no longer simply serving food or delivering drinks. He was part of a larger vision. Every detail, from the perfectly crafted meals to the warm smiles that greeted each guest, was a testament to the culture of care and respect that had become ingrained in the restaurant. But as he settled into this new life, John couldn't ignore the thought that had lingered in the back of his mind for weeks. How did kindness really shape the world around us? He had witnessed firsthand how a small act of helping Mrs. Wren had not only changed her life, but had ultimately led to a new chapter for him as well. It was as if that one decision, that one choice to go beyond what was expected, had rippled out and affected everything around him. That thought haunted him as he worked, and soon it became a driving force in his life. He began to consider what it meant to truly make an impact, not just for himself, but for others. In his own quiet way, he realized that the choices he made, the actions he took, could shape the future. He had seen it happen with Mrs. Wren. But how many others were out there, like her, waiting for someone to notice, to see their worth, to show them the kindness they so desperately needed? The more John thought about it, the more he became determined to be that person for others. One afternoon, After the lunch rush had died down, John decided to take a walk through the town. It had been a while since he'd really looked around, taken in the faces of the people who had been a part of his world for so long. He noticed things now that he hadn't before. The elderly man sitting alone on the bench outside the grocery store, the woman carrying bags that were clearly too heavy for her, the young boy sitting on the steps of the library, staring down at his shoes. John realized that his actions could have a ripple effect, not just in the restaurant, but in the wider community. And if he could touch even one life the way he had touched Mrs. Wren's, then maybe, just maybe, he could make a difference in ways he hadn't yet imagined. That afternoon, he began talking to people he'd never really noticed before, helping the elderly man with his groceries, offering to take the bags from the woman, sitting down next to the boy on the steps, and talking to him about his day. None of these gestures were large or grand, but in that moment, it felt like they were exactly what was needed. The connections were real, and the gratitude was tangible. For the first time, John realized that his life, his presence, could be the thing that made someone else's day a little bit easier, a little bit brighter. The following weeks saw John becoming more active in his community, using his spare time to volunteer at local shelters, serve at food banks, and just generally offer help to those who needed it. He didn't advertise his actions, nor did he seek recognition. He simply saw a need and stepped in to fill it, whether it was delivering food to an elderly neighbor or helping at a community fundraiser. And in return, the community began to notice him, not as the waiter or the manager at the restaurant, but as the person who had a genuine care for others, who was willing to do the work that no one else saw. Word spread, slowly at first, but then with increasing momentum. People started to reach out to him, to ask for his help, to thank him for making their lives easier in some way. Through all this, the lessons John had learned continued to unfold. He was no longer the man he had been when he was fired from Benny's diner. That version of him, the one who had been frustrated and defeated, seemed a distant memory. Instead, John had grown into someone who understood the power of small acts of kindness. He had become someone who realized that the true measure of a person was not in what they could accumulate or how much recognition they could get, but in the way they treated others, in how they made people feel seen, heard, and valued. But as his role in the community grew, so too did the ripple effects of his journey. One day, out of the blue, he received a letter. It was from an attorney, informing him that Mrs. Wren had passed away. His heart sank as he read the words, and he couldn't help but reflect on the profound impact she had had on his life. Though she was no longer with him, her legacy lived on in him. Her quiet strength, her grace in the face of adversity, and the simple kindness she had shown him all those months ago had set the stage for his transformation. Her letter, the one she had written so long ago, had been a turning point for him, a reminder of the power of kindness to transform lives. Along with the letter was a small envelope addressed to John. Inside was a final note from Mrs. Wren, along with a small token. The note read, "I knew you would understand the power of kindness, John. I have nothing to leave but this token, a small gift to remind you of the impact you've had on my life and on those around you. May you always keep this close and remember that no act of kindness, no matter how small, ever goes unnoticed." The token was a small, intricately carved wooden heart, simple, yet full of meaning. John held it in his hand, feeling a deep sense of gratitude wash over him. He placed the heart on the windowsill of his apartment, a constant reminder of the lessons he had learned and the way his journey had unfolded. As time went on, John's role in the community continued to evolve. He wasn't just helping people anymore. He was building a network, an actual movement of people who believed in the power of kindness, people who were willing to go out of their way to make the world a better place. It started as small ripples, like the ones he had felt from his simple act of helping Mrs. Wren, but soon it became something larger. His restaurant became a place where community members gathered, not just for food, but to share ideas, to support one another, and to work together toward a common goal. John's vision had expanded beyond the walls of the restaurant, and he had become a true leader in the community, a leader not by title, but by example. And so, as John looked around at the changes in his life, at the people whose paths he had crossed, he realized that his journey had taken him exactly where he needed to be. He had learned that it wasn't about the grand gestures or the accolades. It was about the small, everyday acts of kindness that rippled out into the world, creating change one moment at a time. He had started with a simple act of service to an elderly woman, and now he was living a life that was full of purpose and meaning. In the end, he had discovered that the true measure of success wasn't in what you achieved for yourself, but in the way you helped others achieve something greater than themselves. And in that, John found peace, knowing that his life had touched more lives than he could ever have imagined. Looking back at everything, he could only ask one question: how far could kindness truly go, and how much more could he do to keep that ripple effect alive? And as he pondered this, he realized the answer didn't lie in a single moment. It was a lifetime of moments, all adding up to something far bigger than he could have ever anticipated.